In the annals of American crime, few names carry as much weight as John Wayne Gacy. He is remembered not simply as a serial killer, but as a grotesque contradiction, a man who balanced two sharply divergent lives with chilling effectiveness. To neighbors in suburban Chicago during the 1970s, Gacy was a jovial contractor, a man quick with a joke, eager to lend a helping hand, and devoted to community activities. He volunteered with the local Democratic Party, threw block parties that drew entire neighborhoods, and donned the colorful costume of Pogo the Clown to entertain children at charity events and hospitals. His was the kind of outwardly wholesome American life that seemed immune to darkness. Yet behind this carefully maintained mask lay one of the most horrifying series of crimes in modern U.S. history. The story of John Wayne Gacy has endured not merely because of the sheer brutality of his acts, but because of the duplicity that defined his existence. While he laughed with families at parades and visited political functions, he also prowled the Chicago area for vulnerable young men and boys, many of them runaways or teenagers searching for work. He lured them into his home with promises of employment, money, or simply companionship. What followed was a descent into nightmare, torture, assault, and ultimately murder. Gacy's ability to conceal his monstrous side for so long challenged society's assumptions about evil, suggesting it could wear a friendly face, shake your hand, and wave from the porch of a neat suburban home. The revelations that emerged after his arrest in December 1978 stunned the nation. The discovery of a veritable graveyard beneath his modest ranch house at 82113 West Summerdale Avenue transformed the Gacy case from local tragedy to national fixation. 29 victims were exhumed from the crawl space, while others were found in nearby rivers, making the final tally 33 confirmed murders. Each body unearthed from the damp clay beneath his home told a silent story of vulnerability exploited, trust betrayed, and innocence destroyed. It was not merely the number of victims that shocked the public, but the proximity of their burial to Gacy's daily life. While his wife and stepdaughters moved about the house above, while guests laughed at barbecues in the backyard, beneath them lay a labyrinth of corpses, layered one upon another in grotesque succession. The discovery of these horrors forced Americans to reconsider notions of safety, trust, and appearances. Suburban life in the post-war era had been idealized as the pinnacle of security, a world of trimmed lawns and friendly neighbors where darkness seemed an impossibility. Gacy shattered that illusion. He demonstrated with chilling finality that the suburbs could harbor predators just as easily as the anonymous alleys of a city. The mask of normalcy could be painted on thickly, hiding the corruption festering below. It was this duplicity, this blending of the ordinary with the monstrous, that made Gacy such a figure of enduring fascination. The case also illuminated the fragile state of law enforcement systems during the 1970s. Many of Gacy's victims were young men estranged from their families, drifters, or boys who had run away from home. Their disappearances often went unnoticed or uninvestigated for extended periods, dismissed as the natural outcome of troubled youth fleeing responsibility. In some cases, police accepted Gacy's explanations at face value, failing to connect the pattern of disappearances that clustered around his neighborhood. This negligence, in part a reflection of the era's limited understanding of serial crime, allowed Gacy to continue his spree for years. By the time the pieces began to coalesce in late 1978, dozens of lives had already been extinguished. Yet even as law enforcement bore criticism for its slow response, the case revealed how dogged investigation and community persistence could finally bring down a predator. The disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Peast, a boy with no history of running away, and a close relationship with his family proved the fulcrum on which Gacy's double life began to collapse. Police suspicion sharpened, surveillance intensified, and eventually the mask cracked. When Gacy was finally cornered, the image of the clown dissolved into something far darker, an embodiment of hidden corruption and concealed brutality. Beyond the horror of the crimes themselves, the figure of John Wayne Gacy captured imaginations because of the uncanny way he blurred boundaries between innocence and evil. The clown, historically a symbol of childhood joy and laughter, became in his hands a sinister disguise. Pogo the clown has since entered American folklore as a symbol of distorted innocence, fueling widespread fears of clowns in popular culture. Gacy's story, then, was never confined to the criminal justice system. It seeped into art, literature, film, and cultural myth-making. He became not merely a killer, but a symbol of how evil can infiltrate the seemingly safe spaces of ordinary life. The broader implications of his case stretch far beyond true crime fascination. His crimes raised questions about the nature of evil, the psychology of predators, and society's tendency to overlook warning signs in favor of maintaining comfortable illusions. His case influenced both criminology and law enforcement approaches to serial offenders, emphasizing the need for better coordination across jurisdictions, more thorough investigation into missing persons, and a deeper recognition of patterns of predation. In the decades since his execution, Gacy has been analyzed in countless books, documentaries, and academic studies, all seeking to understand how one man could cloak so much horror behind the guise of normalcy. As we begin to examine John Wayne Gacy's life and crimes in detail, it is essential to recognize that his story is not merely one of sensational murder. It is also a story of systemic failure, a vulnerable youth left unprotected, of a society slow to recognize the possibility of monsters hiding in plain sight. It is the story of a man whose own troubled childhood and inner conflicts warped into a destructive path, yet whose agency in committing unspeakable crimes cannot be excused by circumstance. His life forces us to consider the uncomfortable reality that evil does not always announce itself with menace. Sometimes it greets you with a smile, shakes your hand, and asks for your vote at a neighborhood meeting. John Wayne Gacy's name endures because he embodies the terrifying possibility of the hidden predator. He was not an outcast lurking on the margins of society, but a man embedded within it, thriving on its trust. In this way, he is a figure both unique and archetypal, a reminder of how deeply appearances can mislead, and how vigilance, justice, and remembrance must stand guard against the recurrence of such horrors. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, the second of 3 children in a working-class family of Polish and Danish descent. His parents, John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robinson, lived in a modest home on the city's northwest side. From the start, Gacy's childhood was framed by contradictions. On the one hand, his mother provided warmth, patience, and affection, doing her best to nurture her children in an environment where resources were limited. On the other hand, his father loomed as a figure of unrelenting severity, a man whose notions of masculinity were bound tightly to toughness, dominance, and control. Within the walls of that home, the seeds of John's future struggles were sown, seeds that combined insecurity, longing, and suppressed anger into a volatile mix that would later explode in devastating ways. His father, a World War I veteran and auto repair machinist, embodied the archetype of the strict patriarch. He was known for drinking heavily and wielding his temper freely. often targeting young John with verbal insults and physical punishment. Sissy, mama's boy, and weakling were the kinds of words hurled at the boy with crushing regularity. Nothing John did seemed sufficient to win approval. When he tried to help with household tasks, he was scolded for doing them wrong. When he played with other children, he was accused of being too soft. When he expressed interest in activities outside the rigid mold of masculinity his father expected, he was met with disdain. For a boy desperate to be seen, this constant belittlement carved deep scars into his sense of self-worth. One incident, often recounted in later psychological profiles, illustrates the father's cruelty. As a child, Gacy once tried on his mother's dress out of curiosity. When his father discovered him, he was brutally beaten, the act framed as punishment for weakness and deviance. Such moments crystallized in young John the fear that any deviation from a rigid masculine ideal would provoke not only ridicule, but violence. The emotional climate of the Gacy household was one where shame, rather than guidance, was the prevailing force. His mother, though protective and loving, could do little to shield him from his father's temper. John's relationship with her became a lifeline of comfort, yet also a source of tension, as his closeness to her was weaponized by his father in accusations of weakness. Compounding these emotional wounds were Gacy's ongoing health struggles. He suffered from a congenital heart condition that left him with frequent fainting spells and limited stamina. At a time when physical prowess was prized, especially by his father, John's inability to participate fully in sports made him feel alienated. He was discouraged from roughhousing and athletics, further isolating him from male peers. The fainting spells, which sometimes occurred without warning, made him the subject of ridicule among classmates, and his father interpreted them not as medical misfortune, but as evidence of cowardice. Such reactions reinforced the narrative that John was defective, incapable of embodying the toughness expected of him. Despite these limitations, Gacy sought ways to excel. He showed an early aptitude for leadership in small group settings and a knack for gaining attention through humor. His desire to be liked often translated into people-pleasing behavior, a pattern that would persist throughout his life. While his father remained a harsh critic, Gacy found validation from teachers and friends who recognized his eagerness to engage. Yet this external affirmation never fully erased the void left by his father's disapproval. The psychological tension between the need for approval and the fear of rejection became one of the defining struggles of his adolescence. School, too, proved challenging. His academic performance was mediocre, partly due to frequent absences caused by health issues, and partly due to a lack of focus. Teachers often described him as bright, but inattentive, a boy who could charm when he wanted to, but who struggled to apply himself consistently. He was neither a star student nor a social pariah, existing instead in a gray zone where he was noticed but not celebrated. In hindsight, this ambiguous social standing foreshadowed the way he would later navigate adult life, never fully prominent in legitimate spheres, yet always striving for recognition through alternative, often darker channels. Adolescence brought with it additional complications. As Gacy grew older, he became increasingly aware of his own sexual identity and desires, though in the context of the 1950s, these realizations carried with them layers of shame and secrecy. His father's constant accusations of effeminacy created a hostile environment in which exploration of identity was fraught with fear. Gacy learned early to compartmentalize, to hide aspects of himself that might provoke ridicule. This tendency towards secrecy would become a central feature of his adult life, allowing him to cultivate an outward persona of normalcy while burying darker urges beneath layers of deception. During his teenage years, Gacy worked a series of part-time jobs, displaying a strong work ethic and a desire to earn money independently. Employment gave him both structure and validation, showing him that he could succeed outside the sphere of his father's judgment. At the same time, however, the desire to escape his father's scrutiny grew ever stronger. Gacy began to envision a life where he could reinvent himself, free from the constraints of his household. Though his health issues persisted, he sought opportunities to carve out an identity beyond that of the weakling son. This yearning for independence would drive him in his early adult years, as he left Chicago in search of a fresh start. The picture that emerges from Gacy's childhood is one of contradictions. A boy raised with warmth from one parent and cruelty from the other. A child eager to please, yet consistently shamed. A youth limited by physical frailty, yet determined to find validation elsewhere. It is tempting to trace a direct line from these early struggles to his later crimes, but such reductionist thinking risks excusing his choices. Many children endure abusive homes without becoming predators. What Gacy's childhood does reveal, however, is the shaping of patterns, the desperate hunger for approval, the reliance on secrecy, the fragility of self-esteem, and the simmering resentment that would later explode in the form of control over others. His early years did not predetermine his crimes, but they created a psychological landscape ripe for the distortions that would follow. By the time John Wayne Gacy emerged into young adulthood, he was a man shaped by fear, longing, and contradiction. The boy who longed for his father's praise but never received it. The adolescent who learned to mask his insecurities with charm. The teenager who discovered the power of controlling appearances. All of these strands intertwined to create a complex figure. The seeds of his double life had been planted long before his first crime. They would lie dormant for years, waiting for the right conditions to sprout into the horrors that would one day shock the world. As John Wayne Gacy entered his teenage years in the mid-1950s, the contradictions that defined his childhood began to sharpen. He was no longer the frail boy seeking to escape his father's taunts, but an adolescent struggling to carve out a space in a world that seemed to view him with suspicion and dismissal. His congenital health issues continued to plague him, leaving him unable to fully engage in the physical world his father prized. The fainting spells, heart pains, and general weakness often confined him indoors, making him appear softer than his peers. Yet Gacy refused to be invisible. He found new outlets for expression in part-time jobs and social activities, using humor, friendliness, and charm as weapons against the sense of inadequacy that clung to him. By his mid-teens, Gacy had become adept at navigating dual identities. To peers, he played the role of a friendly and helpful young man, always willing to pitch in, whether at school functions or neighborhood gatherings. He gravitated toward positions where he could command attention, often volunteering for tasks that allowed him to be seen as responsible and reliable. But beneath this cultivated exterior simmered the old wounds inflicted by his father's contempt. Every laugh from friends, every word of praise from teachers or employers carried with it a bittersweet undertone, for Gacy knew it was not the approval he craved most. His father remained unyielding, dismissing his son's achievements as meaningless or undeserved. Gacy's adolescence was marked by a restless pursuit of belonging. Employment became his refuge. At 14, he took on odd jobs, showing an eagerness to earn his own way. He mowed lawns, worked in grocery stores, and later secured positions in retail. His reliability impressed employers, who saw in him a young man willing to work hard, even if his stamina was limited. This ability to win over authority figures outside the home hinted at a skill Gacy would later refine into a tool of manipulation. He learned that by projecting eagerness and loyalty, he could gain trust and, with it, a measure of power. The social world of adolescence was more complex. Gacy was not an outcast, but neither was he among the most popular. His health and his father's constant berating left him self-conscious, and he often compensated by trying to ingratiate himself with others. Some classmates found his friendliness genuine. Others thought it forced, even slightly strange. He began to understand the art of reading people, tailoring his behavior to what he sensed they wanted. To one group he could be a joker, to another, a helpful friend, to teachers, a diligent student trying his best. This chameleon-like ability would later become essential to his double life as a respected community member and hidden predator. One of the most striking elements of Gacy's teenage years was his struggle with his emerging sexuality. In the conservative climate of the 1950s Midwest, discussions of sexuality, especially homosexuality, were often tinged with shame and secrecy. Gacy's father's accusations of effeminacy had already instilled in him the fear that his desires were abnormal or unacceptable. As he began to recognize his attraction to other males, he also learned to bury those feelings beneath layers of denial. Outwardly, he pursued the trappings of heterosexual normalcy. He dated girls, attended dances, and sought to project the image of a young man conforming to societal expectations. Inwardly, he wrestled with impulses he could not reconcile with the moral and familial codes imposed on him. This conflict deepened his reliance on secrecy and performance, teaching him to divide his inner world from his outer one. The tension between appearance and reality was further compounded by his strained family life. His relationship with his father never improved. Despite John's efforts to prove himself through work and responsibility, his father continued to see him as a disappointment. The physical abuse lessened as John grew older, but the verbal assaults continued, chipping away at his self-esteem. In later interviews, Gacy would recount how he longed for even a single word of approval from his father, a moment of recognition that never came. His mother, by contrast, remained his defender, a source of comfort in an otherwise hostile home environment. This uneven dynamic reinforced in John a sense that love was conditional, something to be won through performance rather than given freely. After high school, Gacy sought to escape the gravitational pull of his father's judgment. Though he lacked strong academic credentials, he enrolled in a business college in Chicago, focusing on management and sales. Here, his charisma and work ethic began to pay off. He quickly demonstrated an ability to lead and to persuade, skills that positioned him well for a career in business. Sales appealed to him because it was a field where charm and presentation could outweigh substance. He discovered that he could use his personality to shape perceptions, to win over clients and supervisors alike. It was intoxicating proof that he could succeed outside the shadow of his father's scorn. During this period, Gacy's interest in politics and community involvement also began to take shape. He volunteered with local Democratic Party events, where his eagerness and willingness to serve made him a useful figure. He enjoyed the sense of belonging and the opportunities to network with people of influence. It was another arena in which he could reinvent himself, polishing the outward image of a young man on the rise. Yet even as he built this facade of responsibility and ambition, his inner life grew increasingly fractured. By his early 20s, Gacy had moved out of his parents' home, seeking independence. His departure did little to mend relations with his father, but it gave him the freedom to craft his identity more fully. He secured steady employment in management positions, eventually working for a shoe company, where he impressed superiors with his enthusiasm. At the same time, he entered into his first marriage to Marlyn Myers, the daughter of a wealthy business associate. Their union seemed to signal his arrival into respectable adulthood. A career man, a husband, and soon a father. Yet beneath this veneer of conventional success, the patterns of secrecy, denial, and suppressed desire continued to shape his behavior. What stands out in this stage of Gacy's life is the degree to which he mastered the art of performance. As a boy, he had learned to tailor himself to the expectations of others in order to avoid ridicule. As a young man, he expanded that skill into a tool for advancement. He could present himself as the diligent employee, the loving husband, the ambitious community member. But behind closed doors, in moments of privacy, the dissonance between his outer persona and inner self grew sharper. His emerging double life was not yet criminal, but the foundations had been laid. He had learned how to compartmentalize, how to build walls between what the world saw and what he kept hidden. In retrospect, the story of Gacy's adolescence and early adulthood reads like a slow accretion of contradictions. The boy who was mocked for weakness grew into a man who sought power through charm. The youth ashamed of his desires became the adult who hid them behind the mask of respectability. The son who longed for his father's approval became the man determined to win the admiration of his community. These tensions did not yet erupt into violence, but they created the psychological scaffolding that would later support his crimes. For now, John Wayne Gacy was still a young man on the ascent, a husband and father carving out a life in the suburbs. But the cracks were already visible, and beneath the facade of normalcy, darker impulses stirred. By the mid-1960s, John Wayne Gacy appeared to have achieved the very life that had long eluded him in his youth. He was in his early 20s, married to Marlynn Myers, the daughter of a prosperous businessman in Waterloo, Iowa. The union was, at least outwardly, a golden ticket into respectability and stability. Marlynn's father entrusted Gacy with the management of several Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises he owned, giving the young man a steady income, a managerial title, and the chance to flex his charisma in a position of authority. The couple settled into a comfortable home in Waterloo, where they would eventually raise 2 children. To neighbors and friends, Gacy seemed like the model of a young husband and father, hard-working, ambitious, and community-minded. In many ways, this period marked the apex of Gacy's outward success. He embraced his new role with enthusiasm, throwing himself into the restaurant business. As a manager, he commanded employees with a blend of friendliness and strictness, striving to maintain high standards while keeping morale high. He enjoyed the feeling of authority, the sense that people looked to him for guidance. The pay was solid, and the perks of being associated with a local business family gave him status in Waterloo society. He joined the local JCs, the Junior Chamber of Commerce, an organization that cultivated civic leadership among young men. Within the JCs, Gacy flourished, quickly rising in prominence. He was known for his tireless work ethic, his ability to organize events, and his eagerness to host gatherings. But beneath this picture of respectability, darker currents were already flowing. The JCs, though a civic group, had a reputation in some chapters for blurring the lines between community service and hedonistic indulgence. Members often bonded over heavy drinking, extramarital affairs, and even the sharing of pornographic films. For Gacy, the JCs offered more than civic advancement. They provided a permissive environment where boundaries could be tested and secret desires more freely expressed. It was in this world that Gacy began to cultivate relationships that allowed him to explore the darker sides of his sexuality, albeit in secret. The contradictions in Gacy's life grew starker during these years. At home, he was the dutiful husband and father, presenting the image of suburban normalcy. At work, he was the driven manager, eager to climb the ladder of success. Within the JCs, he was the sociable member, always ready to organize a gathering or supply entertainment. But behind closed doors, he was beginning to act on impulses that had long simmered beneath the surface. His attraction to young men and boys, suppressed during his adolescence, began to emerge in troubling ways. Gacy learned to exploit his position of authority, both as an employer and as a community figure, to lure teenagers into his orbit. It was during this period that Gacy first crossed the line into criminal behavior. By 1967, rumors circulated within the JCs and the broader Waterloo community that Gacy had inappropriate relationships with teenage boys. He allegedly offered young employees alcohol or access to pornography, then propositioned them for sexual acts. Some accounts suggest he employed a tactic he would later use repeatedly, framing the encounters as experiments or challenges, designed to test boundaries under the guise of trust or fun. Gacy's ability to manipulate and control, skills honed since childhood, were now being weaponized against vulnerable youths. The unraveling came in 1968 with the case of a teenage boy named Donald Voorhees, the son of a fellow JC. Voorhees alleged that Gacy had lured him to his home with the promise of showing pornographic films, then sexually assaulted him. The boy confided in his father, who was both shocked and enraged, particularly since Gacy was a trusted member of the same civic organization. When the allegations became public, the carefully constructed facade of Gacy's respectability began to crack. Other boys soon came forward with similar stories, painting a portrait of predatory behavior that had long been hidden in plain sight. For Gacy, the accusations marked a turning point. He vehemently denied the charges, insisting he was the victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by rivals within the JCs. His defense was not entirely implausible on its surface. After all, small-town politics could be vicious, and Gacy had no shortage of competitors for influence. But the consistency of the testimonies, combined with the specificity of the accounts, proved damning. Ultimately, Gacy was charged with sodomy, a serious offense in 1960s Iowa, carrying the potential for a lengthy prison sentence. The trial was a humiliating spectacle. The community that had once embraced Gacy now recoiled in horror at the revelations. His wife, Marlene, humiliated and overwhelmed, filed for divorce, taking their 2 children and severing ties. For Gacy, who had long built his identity on appearances and approval, the public exposure of his secret life was devastating. Yet, even in this moment of disgrace, he maintained an air of denial, insisting on his innocence and portraying himself as a victim of betrayal. In December 1968, Gacy was convicted of sodomy and sentenced to 10 years in prison at the Anamosa State Penitentiary. The sentence was a crushing blow, not only because of its length, but because it stripped away the carefully constructed identity he had spent years cultivating. The husband, the father, the civic leader, the businessman. All of it was gone, replaced by the stigma of a convicted sex offender. His father, who had long derided him as a failure, reportedly told relatives, "I always knew he'd get into trouble." Before Gacy could even begin serving his sentence, his father died from cirrhosis of the liver. John learned of his death while in prison, a final rejection from the man whose approval he had spent his entire life chasing. Prison life, however, revealed another facet of Gacy's personality, his remarkable adaptability. Within months, he ingratiated himself with both fellow inmates and prison staff. He took on work assignments, organized events, and even secured privileges that elevated his status within the penitentiary. He became head cook, a position that gave him influence and mobility, and he participated actively in inmate programs. Remarkably, Gacy managed to project the same aura of diligence and charm that had once won him favor in the outside world. His ability to adapt to new environments, to win trust, and even admiration despite his crimes, was a chilling reminder of his manipulative skill. After serving just 18 months of his 10-year sentence, Gacy was granted parole in June 1970, under the condition that he return to live with his mother in Chicago and observe strict probationary rules. His early release stunned many, but it reflected both his good behavior in prison and the parole board's underestimation of the risks he posed. For Gacy, prison had not reformed him. It had merely reinforced his belief that charm, compliance, and performance could secure freedom. He walked out of Anamosa determined to rebuild his life and bury the stain of his conviction under a new veneer of respectability. The years in Iowa had marked Gacy's first serious brush with the law, but they also revealed the pattern that would define his future crimes: the cultivation of a double life, the use of authority to lure vulnerable youths, the reliance on secrecy and manipulation, and the belief that he could talk his way out of consequences. Though disgraced, divorced, and branded a felon, Gacy emerged from prison with the same hunger for approval and control that had always driven him. The mask of normalcy, temporarily cracked, would soon be repainted more brightly than ever. What lay ahead in Chicago would be the escalation of these patterns into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. When John Wayne Gacy stepped out of the Anamosa State Penitentiary in June 1970, he was, at least on paper, a disgraced man. He was a convicted felon, branded with the stigma of sexual assault, his marriage destroyed, his relationship with his father forever unresolved. Yet Gacy was not content to retreat into obscurity. Instead, he returned to Chicago determined to reconstruct his life and, more importantly, to rebuild the mask of respectability that had cracked during his years in Iowa. Few could have predicted that this period of apparent reinvention would serve as the foundation for his most horrifying crimes. Living once again with his mother in the Norwood Park neighborhood, Gacy wasted no time in creating the appearance of a man committed to moving forward. He secured employment as a cook, then as a contractor, eventually establishing his own small business, PDM Contractors, standing for painting, decorating, and maintenance. The business offered him independence, a sense of authority, and a platform for reintegration into the community. Gacy excelled at cultivating clients, using his charm and easy humor to put people at ease. He bid competitively on projects and quickly earned a reputation as a reliable and hard-working businessman. For neighbors and customers, John Gacy was a man who had found his footing again. Beyond his business, Gacy sought to immerse himself in civic and political life. He became active in the Democratic Party of Cook County, where his eagerness to volunteer at fundraisers, parades, and rallies made him a familiar face. He shook hands with politicians, attended neighborhood meetings, and positioned himself as a reliable foot soldier in local politics. In photographs from this period, Gacy can be seen grinning alongside prominent officials, his stout frame clad in a suit, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of belonging. Politics offered him not only status, but also cover. In the swirl of handshakes and smiles, his past conviction faded from memory. It was during this same period that Gacy discovered a role that would forever shape his legacy: Pogo the Clown. Adopting the costume of a circus clown, he began performing at children's parties, charity events, and hospital visits. The transformation was more than an eccentric hobby. It was an embodiment of the double life Gacy had been perfecting since adolescence. In the guise of Pogo, with painted smile and oversized shoes, he entertained children, eliciting laughter and joy. To parents and neighbors, this act of volunteerism seemed nothing short of wholesome, the very picture of a man devoted to community. Yet in retrospect, the clown costume became a chilling symbol of the mask behind which Gacy hid his predatory urges. The clown, a figure meant to represent innocence and mirth, was, in his hands, a grotesque disguise. The neighbors of Summerdale Avenue, where Gacy eventually purchased his modest ranch-style home, saw him as a pillar of the community. He hosted large gatherings, barbecues, and social events, often filling his yard with music and laughter. He seemed generous, offering jobs through his contracting company to local youths and opening his doors to neighbors. Few suspected that the crawl space beneath that house would, within a few years, become one of the most infamous burial grounds in American history. To understand Gacy's effectiveness in cultivating this public persona, one must recognize his skill in reading people's expectations. He understood what communities valued: hard work, political engagement, volunteerism, and a touch of eccentricity that made him memorable. He provided all of these in abundance, and in doing so, he disarmed suspicion. Even when whispers about his temper or unusual relationships with younger men surfaced, they were dismissed as the quirks of a man who otherwise contributed so much. His ability to occupy a position of trust within the very community he would later terrorize remains one of the most unsettling elements of his story. Yet beneath the surface of this respectable life, the darker patterns that had emerged in Iowa never truly vanished. Gacy's business became a means not only of financial stability, but also of access to victims. He frequently hired teenage boys, often those who were vulnerable, troubled, or in need of quick work. To them, he presented himself as a benefactor, offering employment and mentorship. But the power imbalance, coupled with Gacy's manipulative tendencies, made these relationships deeply exploitative. In time, the same tactics he had once used in Waterloo, offering alcohol, making suggestive remarks, testing boundaries under the guise of trust, resurfaced with renewed force. His second marriage, to Carol Hoff in 1972, initially seemed to cement his reintegration. Hoff, a recently divorced mother of two, was charmed by Gacy's humor and stability. For a time, their household seemed a picture of suburban normalcy. Yet Hoff would later recall troubling aspects of their life together: Gacy's mood swings, his late-night disappearances, his insistence on controlling the household environment. The marriage deteriorated as Hoff became increasingly suspicious of his behavior. By 1976, the union ended in divorce, further freeing Gacy from the constraints of a family life that had at least superficially tethered him to normalcy. The dissolution of his second marriage coincided with the escalation of his crimes. Freed from the need to maintain the role of husband, Gacy devoted more time to his business, his political engagements, and, in secret, the pursuit of his violent urges. Yet, remarkably, his public image only seemed to grow stronger. He was photographed with First Lady Rosalynn Carter in 1978, wearing a pin that marked him as part of the U.S. Secret Service detail. A surreal image in hindsight, given that by that time several victims were already buried beneath his home. The sheer audacity of Gacy's double life underscores the effectiveness of his mask. To the outside world, he was Pogo the clown, the friendly contractor, the active Democrat, the neighbor who hosted parties. To those who encountered his darker side, he was a predator who wielded charm and authority as weapons. This tension between the public persona and the private reality is what makes the Gacy case so disturbing even decades later. It forces us to confront the possibility that evil can thrive undetected, not because it hides in shadows, but because it cloaks itself in light. By the late 1970s, the cracks in Gacy's facade had begun to widen. Rumors about missing boys swirled, and some parents quietly voiced suspicions about the man on Summerdale Avenue. But for years, his mask held the clown costume, the political photographs, the jovial barbecues. These distractions allowed him to continue his crimes in plain sight. It was a grotesque performance, staged for a community eager to believe in the safety of its own illusions. Only when the disappearance of Robert Piest in December 1978 brought sustained scrutiny to Gacy's world did the curtain begin to fall. By the mid-1970s, John Wayne Gacy's life had crystallized into two starkly divergent realities. To his neighbors, he was still the affable contractor and community volunteer, the man who donned a clown costume to delight children, and whose front yard became the site of sprawling summer barbecues. To the political circles of Cook County, he was the eager foot soldier, smiling in photographs beside city officials. But beyond the cheerful facade lay a hidden world of predation. The same qualities that made Gacy an effective businessman and neighbor, charm, confidence, and an ability to disarm suspicion, became tools he wielded in the pursuit of his victims. At the heart of Gacy's double life was his ability to compartmentalize. He could spend an afternoon painting faces at a children's hospital, then return home and descend into the crawl space where bodies were hidden. He could shake hands with community leaders while knowing that beneath his own home lay the evidence of his crimes. This separation was not accidental. It was cultivated through years of practice, beginning in his adolescence, when he learned to hide his insecurities beneath a mask of humor, and later in Iowa, when he maintained the image of a family man while preying on teenage boys. In Chicago, he perfected the art of duplicity, creating a public persona so convincing that even when rumors surfaced, few wanted to believe them. Gacy's victims were typically young men and teenage boys, often on the margins of society. Many were runaways, hitchhikers, or youths seeking part-time employment. His construction business provided a ready cover for recruitment. He offered odd jobs and day work, drawing in those who needed cash quickly. Others he met through social circles, parties, or simply on the street. Once he established contact, Gacy's charm and apparent generosity disarmed suspicion. He was, after all, a man with a nice house, steady work, and connections in the community. To a vulnerable teenager, he appeared trustworthy. His methods of control often began with small tests of trust. He offered alcohol, marijuana, or cash. He presented himself as a mentor figure, someone willing to help a young man find direction. But behind the veneer of kindness lurked manipulation. One of his favored tactics was the so-called handcuff trick. He would produce a pair of handcuffs, demonstrate how to lock them on his own wrists, and then slip free using a hidden key. Laughing, he would invite his victim to try. Once the cuffs snapped shut, however, the game turned deadly serious. With the victim immobilized, Gacy revealed his true intentions. What followed was torture, sexual assault, and in most cases, murder. The killings themselves revealed Gacy's need for control as much as for gratification. He often strangled his victims, sometimes using a makeshift tourniquet fashioned from a rope and a stick. The act of tightening the noose, of determining the moment of death, underscored the absolute dominance he sought over those he lured. In other instances, he suffocated them with a pillow or gag. His methods were chilling not only for their brutality, but for the ritualistic sense of power they conveyed. Gacy's crimes were not random acts of violence. They were carefully staged exercises in control, where the victim's helplessness became the ultimate expression of his dominance. Yet even as he committed these atrocities, Gacy continued to present himself as the embodiment of suburban respectability. He maintained his business, hosted parties, and entertained guests in the very house under which his victims were buried. The dissonance between the ordinary and the monstrous was staggering. At one of his famous summer gatherings, as neighbors laughed and children played, the earth beneath their feet already contained bodies stacked in shallow graves. For Gacy, the ability to maintain this dual existence was a source of pride, proof of his cleverness and superiority. He boasted to acquaintances about his connections in politics and law enforcement, often suggesting that he was untouchable. The psychological mechanisms that enabled this double life remain a subject of fascination for criminologists and psychologists alike. Gacy exhibited traits associated with psychopathy: superficial charm, manipulation, lack of empathy, and an absence of genuine remorse. He viewed people not as individuals, but as instruments, to be used for his gratification or discarded once their usefulness ended. His ability to separate his public persona from his private reality was so complete that even those closest to him, including his second wife and neighbors, failed to see the full scope of his depravity until it was too late. The contradictions extended even to his role as Pogo the Clown. For Gacy, the clown persona was not merely a costume but a metaphor for his entire existence. The painted smile concealed whatever lurked beneath, offering laughter while hiding menace. Some later accounts suggested that Gacy occasionally blurred the line between his clown performances and his predatory urges, using Pogo as both mask and outlet. In interviews, he would later dismiss the idea that Pogo was tied to his crimes, insisting the two lives were separate. Yet the cultural impact of the association was undeniable. Pogo became a symbol of the grotesque fusion of innocence and evil, a reminder that masks are not always playful, and that behind painted smiles, darkness can hide. As Gacy's predations continued, the walls of his double life began to strain under the weight of rumor. Parents of missing boys sometimes noted his name. Police occasionally questioned him, yet his reputation shielded him. He was too involved, too well connected, too ordinary in appearance for people to readily believe he was capable of such horrors. This reluctance to confront the possibility of evil in their midst allowed Gacy to continue his spree unchecked. In this sense, his double life was not sustained by his cunning alone, but by the community's collective desire to believe in appearances. The escalation of his crimes mirrored the growing confidence of his deception. In the early years, he buried his victims in the crawl space beneath his home. When the crawl space filled, he disposed of bodies in rivers or elsewhere. Yet he continued to maintain his cheerful outward persona, convinced that he was beyond suspicion. This audacity, the willingness to kill while simultaneously posing for photographs with political figures and entertaining neighbors, was not simply a reflection of arrogance. It was a testament to how effectively he had convinced himself and others that his two lives could remain forever separate. By the late 1970s, however, the pressure of maintaining this duplicity began to take its toll. Gacy's moods grew more erratic, his temper more volatile. He drank heavily, and those close to him noted sudden bursts of anger. The cracks in the mask were becoming visible, even if the full truth remained hidden. Still, for years, his double life held. The friendly contractor and the killer beneath the house remained, to the outside world, one and the same man. The revelation of what he had done would not come until a single disappearance, that of 15-year-old Robert Piest, forced investigators to peel away the mask. The mask of John Wayne Gacy's public persona. The contractor, the neighbor, the clown, concealed a darker truth that was now bursting into life. After his release from prison in 1970, Gacy promised his parole officers and his mother that he would live as a reformed man. Outwardly, he kept that promise for a time, building his business, establishing friendships, and projecting normalcy. Yet in the privacy of his modest ranch house on Summerdale Avenue, something far more sinister was beginning to unfold. The first confirmed murder attributed to Gacy occurred in 1972, though investigators have long suspected that he may have killed earlier. That year, Gacy lured a young man to his home, likely one of the countless teenagers who drifted in and out of his contracting business. Accounts suggest that the encounter turned violent, leading Gacy to strangle the youth in a sudden explosion of rage and desire for control. Shocked at what he had done but exhilarated by the sense of dominance, Gacy buried the body in the crawl space beneath his home. In later interviews, he would describe this first killing as accidental, a claim consistent with the narratives of many serial offenders who initially seek to mitigate responsibility. But whatever hesitation existed in that moment quickly faded. The act had unlocked something in Gacy that would never again be contained. The crawl space beneath the Summerdale house became both graveyard and secret shrine. Gacy discovered that the loose soil made it possible to dig shallow graves with relative ease. He rationalized the burials as practical, even clever. The concealment beneath his own home became part of his ritual, embedding his crimes within the very foundations of the life he presented to the world. Each body placed in that dark earth was both evidence of his brutality and a symbol of his arrogance, a declaration that he could live above his crimes without consequence. From that first killing in 1972 until his capture in 1978, the number of victims steadily grew. Gacy's method, refined through repetition, followed a chilling pattern. He targeted young men, often between the ages of 14 and 21, though some were younger. Many were runaways, boys estranged from their families, or teenagers looking for work. Gacy exploited this vulnerability, offering them a place to stay, a job, or money. His genial manner, coupled with his reputation as a businessman and community figure, lowered defenses. Once inside his home, the game began. The infamous handcuff trick became his signature. Producing a pair of handcuffs, he demonstrated how he could slip free, presenting it as a harmless magic trick. When the victim attempted it, however, the cuffs clicked shut and remained locked. With the young man immobilized, Gacy revealed the ruse with a chilling phrase. "The trick is, you have to have the key." From that moment, the victim's fate was sealed. What followed was assault, humiliation, and ultimately murder. Gacy preferred strangulation, sometimes using his hands, other times a rope tourniquet tightened with a stick. This slow method of killing gave him a sense of control over the moment of death. For Gacy, the act of killing was not merely the end of violence, but the culmination of power. He determined the rules of the game, dictated the pace of suffering, and controlled the instant life was extinguished. Yet even as the crimes piled up, he maintained his double life seamlessly. The crawl space filled, layer by layer, while parties continued above. Friends laughed in the backyard. Politicians shook his hand. Children cheered at Pogo the clown. The juxtaposition was staggering, but to Gacy it was proof of his own cleverness. The pace of the murders escalated as the years passed. In some instances, he killed multiple victims in the same week. At times, he ran out of space in the crawl space and disposed of bodies in the Des Plaines River. Yet he always returned to his life of appearances, as if nothing had happened. To those who knew him casually, he was quirky, maybe temperamental, but ultimately just another man in the neighborhood. That no one uncovered his secret for so long is a testament both to his manipulative skill and to society's reluctance to confront what seemed unthinkable. As the killings multiplied, Gacy's personality grew increasingly fractured. Those close to him noted erratic mood swings, periods of joviality and energy, followed by stretches of anger and depression. He drank heavily, sometimes descending into rage-filled tirades. At the same time, he continued to expand his political and business connections, cultivating a protective shield of respectability. The dissonance between his outward life and his inner horrors was reaching breaking point. But for years it held. The victims of John Wayne Gacy were not faceless statistics. They were sons, brothers, and friends, young men who trusted a stranger offering kindness and were met instead with unspeakable cruelty. Their disappearances left families bewildered, often dismissed by authorities who assumed the boys had simply run away. This dismissal, born of stereotypes about teenage rebellion, gave Gacy further room to operate. The very invisibility of his victim shielded him, allowing him to continue his spree unchecked. By 1977, the number of missing boys in the Chicago area had grown too large to ignore. Still, Gacy remained beyond suspicion in the eyes of many. He entertained politicians, maintained his business, and lived openly in a house that by then contained dozens of bodies. His confidence soared. He believed he was untouchable. The murders, once spaced apart, became more frequent, driven by both compulsion and the thrill of continued impunity. It was only in December 1978, with the disappearance of Robert Piest, that the house of cards began to fall. But by then, at least 33 lives had been extinguished. The murders that began with a single act of violence in 1972 had grown into one of the most notorious killing sprees in American history. Looking back, the beginning of Gacy's murderous career reveals not only his methods, but his psychology. The murders were not random acts. They were part of a carefully cultivated system of control, concealment, and performance. Each victim represented both gratification and proof of Gacy's belief that he could live above suspicion. The crawl space beneath his home became both tomb and trophy room, the silent witness to his double life. The murders began quietly, but once set in motion, they gathered a momentum that only ended with his capture 6 years later. Beneath the unassuming ranch house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue in Norwood Park, Chicago, there lay a darkness that would become one of the most chilling symbols of American crime. For years, the crawl space under John Wayne Gacy's home served as both graveyard and grotesque sanctuary, silently housing the evidence of his crimes, while life above carried on with deceptive normalcy. Friends and neighbors walked through the house. Politicians shook Gacy's hand in the living room. Children laughed in the backyard. All while, only a few feet beneath their shoes, the remains of dozens of young men and boys lay buried. The crawl space itself was nothing extraordinary at first glance. Like many homes in the area, it was a narrow, unfinished cavity beneath the floorboards, accessible through a hatch in the basement. It was cramped, low-ceilinged, and filled with damp earth. But in Gacy's hands, this mundane architectural feature became the perfect hiding place. After his first murder in 1972, Gacy discovered how easy it was to dig shallow trenches in the loose soil. What began as a practical solution to concealment grew into a ritual. The crawl space became his private necropolis, a place where he could both dispose of his victims and assert the twisted sense of control that defined his crimes. Each burial was a calculated act. Gacy dug trenches and arranged bodies in layers, often placing one atop another as space grew scarce. Over the years, he developed a morbid system, referring to certain parts of the crawl space as trenches or rooms, tagsudaki. He even assigned tasks related to the crawl space to employees of his contracting business under innocent pretenses, having them spread lime to mask odors or dig areas he would later use for burials. None of those workers suspected the true purpose of their labor, though some later recalled the unsettling smell that lingered beneath the house. The smell was, in fact, one of the most persistent features of the Summerdale home. Neighbors sometimes noticed foul odors drifting from the house, but Gacy always had an explanation. A leaky sewer line, dampness in the soil, or dead rodents. These excuses, delivered with his usual confidence, were accepted at face value. The notion that the stench was caused by decomposing human bodies was so far beyond the imagination of suburban neighbors that it was dismissed almost without thought. In this way, Gacy's ability to maintain appearances once again shielded him from suspicion. The crawl space also became a psychological symbol for Gacy himself. Above ground, he lived the life of a respectable citizen, a businessman, a party host, a clown. Below ground, hidden from view, lay the truth of his compulsions, the physical evidence of his brutality. The duality mirrored the split in his own identity. The house itself became an extension of his double life, light and laughter above, silence and horror below. Each new burial deepened this division, transforming the house into a stage on which Gacy performed his grotesque act of concealment. As the number of victims increased, the crawl space grew crowded. By the mid-1970s, dozens of bodies lay buried there, packed into the earth like grim artifacts of Gacy's compulsion. The logistics of burial became increasingly difficult. Sometimes Gacy dug alone. Other times, he had unsuspecting employees prepare areas he later used for his own purposes. Eventually, when space beneath the house ran out, he resorted to dumping bodies in the Des Plaines River, extending his burial grounds outward. Yet the crawl space remained his preferred site, a private underworld that anchored his crimes. The discovery of the crawl space in December 1978 would become one of the most shocking moments in American criminal history. After Robert Piest's disappearance led police to surveil Gacy, investigators eventually obtained a search warrant for his house. Initial searches turned up suspicious items, including a class ring, handcuffs, and driver's licenses belonging to missing boys. But no bodies. It was only when officers noticed the pervasive odor in the crawl space that the truth began to emerge. A subsequent search revealed the first human remains, partially decomposed and buried in the soil. The news spread rapidly. The image of police and forensic teams crawling beneath the suburban house, emerging with bags of remains, captivated the nation. As more bodies were unearthed, the scale of Gacy's crimes became clear. 29 victims were eventually recovered from the crawl space alone, their identities painstakingly pieced together over time through dental records, personal effects, and later, DNA testing. Each body represented not only a life lost, but also the staggering extent to which Gacy's double life had gone undetected. The basement of horrors shocked the public because it violated the very idea of suburban safety. The notion that beneath an ordinary home, in a quiet neighborhood of trimmed lawns and backyard barbecues, lay a mass grave was almost impossible to fathom. The juxtaposition was too stark, too grotesque. The crawl space became more than a crime scene. It became a symbol of hidden evil, of how darkness can fester beneath the surface of ordinary life. It forever linked Gacy's name not just to murder, but to the image of bodies buried beneath floorboards, silent and unseen. For the families of the victims, the discovery of the crawl space was a double-edged revelation. On one hand, it offered answers to the agonizing question of what had happened to their missing sons. On the other, it confirmed their worst fears in the most horrifying way imaginable. The image of loved ones buried in shallow graves beneath a stranger's home was almost unbearable. The process of identification was long and painful, with some families waiting months or years for confirmation. For others, the truth would never fully come, as some remains were too decomposed to identify even decades later. The crawl space also became central to Gacy's trial and to the cultural memory of his crimes. Prosecutors used it as evidence of premeditation, concealment, and sheer scale. The public, horrified by the details, fixated on the crawl space as the ultimate representation of Gacy's depravity. Journalists described it as a house of horrors, a phrase that would follow the case forever. Even today, the image of the crawl space remains one of the most enduring aspects of the Gacy case, symbolizing both the extent of his cruelty and the chilling banality of its concealment. Perhaps most disturbingly, Gacy himself showed little remorse for what was found beneath his home. In interviews after his arrest, he alternately denied responsibility, claimed memory lapses, or insisted that others had placed bodies there without his knowledge. At times, he even joked about the crawl space, referring to it casually or dismissively, as though the horror it contained were of no consequence. His ability to detach himself from the reality of his crimes only deepened the sense of monstrosity that surrounded him. In the end, the basement of horrors was more than just a crime scene. It was the physical embodiment of Gacy's double life, the hidden underworld beneath the smiling surface, the graveyard beneath the clown. It forced America to confront the possibility that evil need not lurk in distant alleys or shadowy strangers, but could live next door, hosting parties, shaking hands, and burying its victims only a few feet away. By the mid-1970s, the number of missing young men and boys in the Chicago area was quietly growing. To the families left behind, the disappearances were devastating mysteries. To the police, many cases were filed away as runaways or unresolved missing persons reports. This dismissal was not unusual for the time. Teenage boys who vanished were often assumed to have fled broken homes or wandered off in pursuit of adventure. Yet, as the years passed, the names accumulated. Sons, brothers, and friends who simply vanished. Few imagined that the common thread running through so many of these disappearances was a gregarious contractor living in a quiet Norwood Park neighborhood. The unraveling began with a single disappearance that could not be dismissed so easily, that of Robert Piest, a 15-year-old boy from Des Plaines, Illinois. On December 11, 1978, Robert vanished after telling his mother he was going to speak with a contractor about a potential job. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Unlike many of Gacy's previous victims, Robert was not a runaway nor estranged from his family. He was well-liked, responsible, and deeply connected to his parents. When he failed to return home, his absence was immediately noted, and his family pressed the police for answers. Des Plaines police took Robert's disappearance seriously, in part because of his stable background and the precise circumstances of his vanishing. His mother had been waiting for him outside the pharmacy where he worked, expecting him to return after a quick conversation with Gacy. When he never came out, alarm bells rang. Officers began asking questions, and Gacy's name surfaced almost immediately. Unlike other missing boys whose cases had been written off, Robert's case provided investigators with a clear lead and a suspect who, though outwardly respectable, was soon to be revealed as deeply suspicious. When detectives first approached Gacy, he was calm, even affable. He admitted to having spoken to Robert, but insisted the boy had left after their conversation. His demeanor was so convincing that at first, officers were unsure whether to take the suspicions further. But Robert's family was adamant, and the circumstances could not be ignored. Investigators began looking more closely into Gacy's background, and what they found disturbed them. Records of his 1968 conviction for sodomy in Iowa surfaced, painting a very different picture of the friendly contractor. This discovery convinced detectives that Robert's disappearance was no mere coincidence. Armed with this knowledge, police obtained a search warrant for Gacy's house. The first search, conducted on December 13, 1978, did not uncover bodies but turned up a trove of incriminating items. Officers found driver's licenses belonging to missing young men, a class ring engraved with initials that did not match Gacy's, handcuffs, books on homosexuality and sadomasochism, and clothing too small to fit him. Perhaps most disturbingly, they noted the pervasive stench rising from the crawl space, though at that time they did not dig deeper. Gacy brushed it off, claiming the odor was due to plumbing problems and dead rodents. The evidence was enough to intensify the investigation. Detectives began around-the-clock surveillance of Gacy, trailing his every move. What followed was a surreal period in which the killer and the law danced a strange and uneasy waltz. Gacy, aware he was being watched, alternated between arrogance and agitation. At times, he invited detectives into restaurants, buying them meals and joking with them. At other times, he ranted about being harassed, his temper flaring under the pressure. For the officers assigned to tail him, the experience was surreal. They were following a man they suspected of horrific crimes, yet he continued to move about in public, attending political events, visiting friends, and entertaining neighbors as though nothing were amiss. As surveillance continued, Gacy began to unravel. He drank heavily, drove erratically, and spoke with increasing recklessness. In one conversation, he boasted to acquaintances that clowns can get away with murder, a comment that seemed flippant at the time, but would later be remembered as chillingly revealing. Detectives trailing him collected bits of evidence, including receipts, observations, and the testimonies of those who had interacted with him. Slowly, a picture emerged that linked him to multiple disappearances, not just Robert Piest. One key breakthrough came when investigators connected the class ring found in Gacy's home to a missing youth named John Sick. This discovery established a direct link between Gacy and one of the many boys who had vanished in the Chicago area. The walls were closing in. Prosecutors pushed for a second, more extensive search warrant, convinced that beneath the Summerdale house lay the answers to their growing suspicions. Meanwhile, the surveillance was taking its toll on Gacy. The once confident contractor began to crack under the relentless gaze of the law. He complained of headaches, fell asleep at odd times, and lashed out unpredictably. On one occasion, he handed detectives a small packet of marijuana, perhaps as an attempt to distract or implicate them. On another, he hinted ominously that he had done some things he could not explain. Each slip deepened investigators' certainty that they were on the brink of uncovering something monumental. By December 20th, the pressure became unbearable for Gacy. He invited one of his lawyers to his home and, in a rambling confession, admitted to killing maybe 30 people. Though the details were hazy and inconsistent, the sheer scale of the admission stunned those who heard it. Gacy's lawyers informed the police, who quickly secured a second warrant. The following day, December 21st, investigators descended once again into the crawl space. This time, they dug deeper and uncovered the remains of a human body. The dam had burst. Over the following days and weeks, the full horror of the basement of horrors was revealed. Body after body was exhumed from beneath the Summerdale house, each discovery confirming what investigators had begun to fear. The crawl space was not merely a storage of secrets, but a burial ground for nearly 30 victims. Additional remains were recovered from the Des Plaines River, bringing the total to 33 confirmed murders. For the detectives who had worked the case, the revelation was both vindication and nightmare. They had followed the trail with persistence, piecing together fragments of evidence until the picture became undeniable, that nothing could have prepared them for the scale of the crimes they had uncovered. The house on Summerdale, once a symbol of suburban respectability, had become a crime scene of almost unimaginable proportions. The investigation into John Wayne Gacy stands as both a triumph and a cautionary tale. It was a triumph in the sense that dedicated police work, driven by the refusal of Robert Piest's family to accept dismissal, eventually brought a killer to justice. But it was also a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency. For years, the disappearances of vulnerable young men had been ignored or minimized. Only when a boy from a stable family vanished under specific circumstances did the system respond with the urgency required. The delay had cost dozens of lives. The investigation also underscored the importance of persistence in the face of deception. Gacy had spent years cultivating a mask so convincing that even seasoned officers were initially uncertain of his guilt. Only through relentless surveillance and the willingness to follow every lead did the truth emerge. In the end, it was not Gacy's confidence that preserved his double life, but the determination of investigators who refused to let the case of a missing boy be brushed aside. By December 1978, the pressure bearing down on John Wayne Gacy was unbearable. For years, he had balanced on the knife's edge between his public persona and private monstrosity. But the disappearance of Robert Piest had tipped the scales. The police surveillance that shadowed his every move chipped away at his composure, while the growing body of evidence gathered by detectives left him with fewer and fewer places to hide. For a man who had thrived on control, the walls of his world were closing in. The first search of his home had rattled him. Though investigators did not immediately uncover bodies, they found enough suspicious items: driver's licenses belonging to young men, a class ring, handcuffs, pornography, and clothing that could not possibly belong to him. To keep suspicion alive, the smell in the crawl space, which Gacy explained away as plumbing trouble, lingered in the minds of detectives. Still, at that moment, his mask held. He remained outwardly calm, denying involvement in Piest's disappearance, smiling and joking as if nothing were wrong. But beneath the surface, his carefully constructed world was beginning to fracture. The surveillance intensified. Detectives followed him to restaurants, bars, and political meetings, often sitting only a few tables away as he drank heavily and tried to maintain bravado. Sometimes, Gacy engaged with them directly, offering meals or attempting conversation, as if daring them to break character. At other times, his temper flared, and he accused them of harassment. His behavior grew increasingly erratic. He drove recklessly, stayed up for days without sleep, and drank himself into stupors. Those close to him, including his lawyers, began to notice alarming changes. Rambling conversations, bursts of weeping, and disturbing hints at secrets long buried. On December 20th, 1978, Gacy invited two of his lawyers to his office. What began as a casual meeting spiraled into a rambling confession. Between sobs and moments of lucidity, he admitted to killing maybe 30 people. The lawyers, stunned and horrified, pressed for details, but Gacy slipped between denial and admission, sometimes portraying himself as a victim of circumstance, other times hinting at deliberate acts. He confessed to burying bodies in his crawl space and dumping others in the river. The sheer scale of what he revealed shocked even those who had begun to suspect he was guilty of Robert Piest's disappearance. The confession triggered a cascade of events. The lawyers informed authorities, who secured a second search warrant for Gacy's home. This time, police returned with the intent to dig beneath the house. On December 21st, officers descended into the crawl space and uncovered the remains of a human body. The discovery confirmed what had long been suspected, that Gacy was not merely guilty of one boy's disappearance, but of crimes of unimaginable scale. News of the discovery spread rapidly. Reporters converged on Somerdale Avenue, their cameras capturing images of police and forensic teams carrying evidence bags from the home. Neighbors, stunned by the revelation, stood in disbelief, unable to reconcile the friendly man they had known with the horrors now being uncovered beneath his house. The spectacle grew day by day as more bodies were unearthed, each discovery deepening the national shock. Meanwhile, Gacy was formally arrested. Stripped of his bravado, he alternated between defiance and collapse. At times he insisted he was being framed, or that others had buried bodies beneath his house without his knowledge. At other times, he admitted freely to the killings, as though relieved to no longer maintain the charade. In custody, he confessed to dozens of murders. Though his accounts were inconsistent and self-serving, he described his methods with chilling detachment, explaining the handcuff trick and the rope tourniquet as though recounting business procedures. Yet he also cast himself as a victim of circumstance, blaming everything from childhood abuse to stress for his actions. For law enforcement, the arrest was both vindication and nightmare. Years of missing persons cases suddenly converged in one horrifying figure. The scale of the crimes, 33 confirmed murders, was unprecedented in modern American history. Detectives who had once tailed him through diners and bars now listened to his flat admissions of killing young men, struggling to comprehend the coldness with which he described their deaths. The process of exhumation, carried out over weeks, revealed the grotesque truth of his crawl space. Bodies stacked in trenches, layered upon each other, silent witnesses to years of unchecked horror. The public reaction was one of shock, horror, and disbelief. Newspapers across the country carried front-page stories of the killer clown, the seemingly ordinary man who had hidden one of the largest murder sprees in U.S. history beneath his own home. Parents reeled at the thought that someone who had entertained children as Pogo the Clown could also be a predator. Communities questioned how such crimes could have gone unnoticed for so long. The juxtaposition between the cheerful clown and the killer beneath the house became one of the most disturbing cultural images of the decade. For Gacy himself, the capture marked the end of his double life. The mask was gone. No longer could he hide behind his business, his politics, or his clown costume. Stripped of his illusions, he was revealed for what he was, a manipulative, remorseless predator who had exploited trust and appearances to commit atrocities. Yet even after his arrest, he clung to denial and minimization, often portraying himself as misunderstood or claiming that others had exaggerated his crimes. This refusal to fully acknowledge his guilt would become a hallmark of his behavior during trial and imprisonment. The capture of John Wayne Gacy stands as a moment when illusion collided with reality, when the smiling face of suburban normalcy dissolved to reveal the darkness beneath. For years, he had manipulated appearances so effectively that neighbors and acquaintances never saw the truth. But in the end, it was not his charm or cunning that prevailed, but the persistence of investigators and the refusal of a grieving family to let their son's disappearance be dismissed. Robert Piest's absence became the catalyst that brought down one of the most notorious killers in American history. The arrest did not end the story. It merely opened the door to the full reckoning. In the months and years that followed, Gacy's crimes would be dissected in courtrooms, analyzed by psychologists, and absorbed into the cultural consciousness. But the moment of capture, the collapse of the mask, the uncovering of the crawl space, the shocked gasps of neighbors and police alike, remains one of the defining episodes in the history of American true crime.